Hey guys, and welcome to today's video. So in this one I'm going to be reviewing my kind of first month using a 3D printer, specifically the Elegoo Mars Pro. And I've got to say, although it was really intimidating trying to buy one of these things and get into the hobby, I've had an absolute blast with it so far. So let's get on with the review. This is from a complete newbie experience when it comes to 3D printing, and hopefully you'll be able to decide for yourself as a newbie or as a beginner to this hobby, whether or not you want to get a 3D printer to use for like making D&D miniatures or like wargaming. So let's get on with this video. So I've been looking at 3D printers for quite a while. They always just seemed like a very novel thing, and it wasn't until I found out a little bit more about resin printers, which is what I've picked up with the Elegoo Mars Pro. Then they're very different to previous 3D printers that we've seen in the past, which kind of like heat up some plastic, this like spool that goes into it, and then it shoots it all out onto a plate and builds it up. And it always seems as though they just wouldn't be very good for miniatures. And then I saw these resin printers, and basically it takes this resin liquid, puts it into a vat, and it uses a UV light to cure this liquid as it's going through, and it's all, you know, kind of mind-boggling science and all of that stuff. And the results are really, really good. So I've got these sort of like fantasy Warhammer type miniatures here, which came out really, really well, and this sort of troll as well, which I've painted up, and so far I've been really, really impressed with the results. So I'm going to go through a few things that I really like about it, and some of the things to maybe consider when you're maybe looking at purchasing something like the Elegoo Mars Pro, which is the one that I've got in particular. So first up, I'm going to tell you about safety. So you all hear all about resin and making sure you handle this correctly. If you're doing any research into this, one of the things that people shout out about an awful lot. And I've got to say, I absolutely agree with pretty much everything that everybody is saying. Take safety seriously. So make sure you glove up, make sure you have your mask on and all of that, because you don't want to be breathing in any of these fumes or touching any of this stuff. And kind of most importantly, it's not just the resin as well. So the process for me anyways, you print off your print, you take it from the build plate, and then I tend to drop it into some hot water to heat it up so I can remove the supports a little bit easier. Little pro tip there, hot water helps you to remove all the supports as they come out. Just a great way of doing it. Clean it up a bit, and then I pop it into some IPA. And this is where I got a bit stupid. So I wasn't always handling the IPAs, which is your isopropyl alcohol. I'm butchering that word, of course. So I wasn't always handling that particularly well. So I'd always use gloves when I was handling anything that was like resin based. But when it came to the cleaning up afterwards, I wouldn't always wear gloves, and then I'd handle this IPA quite a bit, and it started to make me quite sick. So, you know, make sure you constantly wear your gloves whenever you do it. So taking safety seriously when you're using this is a big thing. Now, one thing I will say is the resin smell isn't particularly bad. It's there. It's almost like this kind of faint plastic odor that kind of sits in the background, but compared to what a lot of people were saying about it, I was expecting it to be far worse. Now, I've been using the Elegoo, I think it's the grey-like resin, and it's perfectly fine. It's very odorless. There is a faint odor, but it's not anything kind of really noxious or awful, but your mileage may vary depending on what kind of resin you use. However, the thing that really, really does stink out the room is the IPA. So when I'm using that, it just absolutely stinks it out. So if you've got a separate space, you can put your 3D printer in, then it's probably going to be more worthwhile. So safety aside, and I guess those little bits of annoyances, is it worth it for 3D printing little minis? Now, obviously, my first impression was that they probably weren't going to come out particularly well. However, when I first started printing these, I was really, really impressed. And actually, I've had only a couple of failed prints, and they were my fault so far. So far, the results have been really, really good. And I haven't dialed in my settings particularly well. I haven't experimented too much. I have achieved better detail than what's showing up on these models, but it means that my print times take a lot longer, and I just wanted to get a few more models knocked out so I could use them with some D&D campaigns in the future. And I've got to say, I am really impressed. Once you kind of get past that initial cleanup stage, removing the supports, kind of breaking off some of the bits of plastic that's left behind, you can get some really, really good results. And I'm by no means a pro painter, but actually I was really impressed with how something like this turned out, and also something like this little demon from Arc Villain Games. There's some really, really impressive detail on these models, and I've been very happy with the results that I've gotten. And for a D&D campaign, being able to print them all off, it just makes a massive difference. I tend to find that something like these little orcs here take about 4.5 hours to print off, and again, that's not dialing in any settings or anything. If I increase the detail level beyond this, it can take up to like 7 or 8 hours, but to be fair, I'm really happy with the detail that comes out at this sort of level. So, you know, be the decider for yourself whether or not that looks good enough for you. Same with this troll. This took about 5 hours to print, and this is on the lower detail side of it. But again, I'm pretty happy with the amount of detail that I got from this, but you can get a little bit more detail from it if you dial in your settings. Now, the other question you might be asking yourself, is it going to be cheaper just buying the models from someone like Games Workshop or buying them elsewhere versus buying yourself a 3D printer and printing them all out yourself. As you've got the cost of the printer, then you've got the cost of things like your IPA and your cleaning stuff. You've also got the cost of the resin. You've got the cost of getting the actual files themselves. You can get some really good free ones, but there's some really good sort of like subscriptions that you can go for with these. So it can become a bit of a money pit. But I've got to say, I've definitely got my money's worth out of it. If I'd have bought all of the models that I've printed out so far for full price from someone like Games Workshop or another modelling company, I would have spent at least the same amount, if not more. I've also printed off a lot of terrain as well, so I've got these like open lock tiles, and I've printed off all of those, which has been good fun, so that way you can create your different custom dungeons or taverns, and there's loads of files available for that. And buying those on their own would have cost an absolute fortune. I think I spent around about £250 in total. I got the Mars Pro on a deal, so it was going for 130 at the time, and then I've bought 2 tubs of resin, and so far out of those 2 tubs of resin, they're a kilogram each, and I've printed off, I have lost count of the amount of models I've printed off. There's all sorts of bits of scenery I've printed, so different chests and barrels and sort of like a blacksmithing area as well. So that way when we create those campaigns in the future for some D&D, I'm going to have all the different bits that can go into it. So it just gives you a lot of flexibility. The other thing that I really like about being able to 3D print rather than buying your models is a lot of the time I'll see a really interesting model from like Games Workshop, for example, but it comes as part of a set, so I then end up with loads of spare models that I'm not necessarily going to use. Whereas with this, you can just choose. If you want to have one orc, you can just print off one orc rather than having like a regiment of 12 orcs or something like that. Also, as well, as a dungeon master, being able to create your space and have different bits of scenery, and if you think, well, actually I want some chests for this, or maybe some bookshelves for this, you can print it all up and just swap things around as and when you want to, and just make your campaigns that little bit more interesting. And it just adds a bit more depth to the game, and it's really good fun. And the amount of stuff that is out there that you can print is just kind of mind-boggling. I was building this sort of like tavern area, and then I was like, oh, I could just kind of customize it and then drop a bit of blacksmithing stuff in there. And of course there was a forge and some bellows and everything else that went with it. I was like, okay, well, this is great. So I got those, printed them off, and it just allows you to change your space up and just, you know, do different things with it. So it's really good fun in that respect. You can print off pretty much anything you want. The only downside that I would say with these, and this might be something that I'm doing, but some of the models I've printed out have been a little bit more brittle than others, and that's probably down to the way that I'm kind of cleaning these up and curing them afterwards. So even once you've taken them off the printer, you've cleaned them all up, and you've snapped off all the supports and everything else, they're not ready to go at that point. You still need to put them under some UV light. So some people use a UV lamp. I stick them in the sunlight outside for a little bit, and that seems to do the trick. But it's hard when you're putting them outside to then kind of measure how long they've been out there and how much UV exposure they've had. And if you give them too much UV exposure, it does make them a bit more brittle. I seem to be getting better, and now things like these kind of weapons, they do have a little bit of give in them, which is not too bad. But a lot of the time I kind of worry that if I drop them, they are going to snap or smash and stuff like that. So that's worthwhile bearing in mind. If you are going to be manhandling them in D&D, then it might be worth just taking into consideration that they are a little bit more fragile than other types of model. However, they are a little bit more durable in another respect that I haven't really thought of about too much, and that's because it prints off in one piece. So unlike something like Warhammer, for example, where often you'll get like the heads not attached or the weapons aren't, and you have to glue them together, this is all just one piece. You don't have to worry about somebody picking it up by the weapon and then the arm coming off, which has happened to me so many times in the past where my gluing technique has clearly failed. So yeah, that's one thing to consider. Durability, they do feel just that little bit more brittle. However, I have read online you can mix different types of resin to get a more model-like feel. But yeah, I've just not had a chance to play with that yet. But again, there's so many things when it comes to this hobby that you... Whoops. Anyway, take 2. Yes, there's so many things when it comes to this hobby that you kind of have to research. So although I've got my printer working really well, it works well for me, I can get it working even better if I spend a lot of time kind of fidgeting with the settings and exploring that. Although I kind of have these at a stage that I'm pretty happy with when it comes to the durability, I could definitely do better by mixing different types of resin and looking into that as well. Case in point there, by snapping off the axe by accident. But all things considered, the Mars Pro was a very, very good purchase, in my opinion anyway. For the price they were asking at the time, 130 quid, you can't go too far wrong. The one thing that I would maybe look for in the future, if I was going to get another 3D printer, is I'd rather have a larger build plate. So at the moment, getting models like these on there is no problem at all. But some of the largest ones that I've had, like that demon that I've shown you from Mark Villain Games, I had to scale it down because it just didn't fit on the build plate, and therefore I had to print it in smaller parts and then stick it all together. It's not the end of the world, but I would like to print off some of those really big projects that I've seen people do, because they look absolutely awesome. And another thing to consider, if you scale down your projects and they're pre-supported, so how these work is you can either get them pre-supported where the person who sculpted them has added the supports to it, or you can use software to add the supports yourself. If you shrink it down and it's pre-supported, the one thing I found is I pretty much always have a failed print when I scale it down, because ultimately those supports then start kind of sticking together. So I tend to get the unsupported model, put it in there, scale it down, and then add the supports myself using Chitubox, which is what the Mars Pro has to use. By doing it that way, I've had no failed prints when I scale the models down. However, when they are pre-supported and you scale them down, do expect some failed prints. Yeah, so do explore that, obviously, if you get into this. Just a little Bolden Gamers tip there for you. But all in all, I am a massive fan of 3D printing. I've got to say, now that I've gone down that rabbit hole, I just can't see myself going back to buying things traditionally. I just really like looking at all the different work out there from different Patreon creators. So there are so many incredible things. So there's some subscriptions out there where if you're a dungeon master, for example, you can basically subscribe to them, and each month you'll get a set of different models. You'll also get the campaign for like a one-shot to play. You'll get all the stat blocks for all your different bits, and it's just incredibly well done and decent value for the money. So they tend to work out about £10 or $10 per month, and you get a huge set of models that you'll be able to print off, paint up, play with, but then also that Dungeons and Dragons campaign to go alongside it. So you know what, it's just such an addictive hobby already. So if you are in the market to use a 3D printer for little miniatures, if you're looking for D&D and stuff like that, it is well worth it. It can seem really intimidating at first, but to be honest, we were complete noobs going into this, and I had no idea how 3D printing was going to work. I'd watched a couple of videos, but it's a pretty easy to do hobby. Once you just kind of start it off, it's really easy to get going. Granted, there's a lot more complicated bits in the background, and you can dial in your settings and all of that, but you don't have to if you don't want to. But if you do want to, then you can explore that, and there's loads of groups out there, and there's loads of websites that show more information about it. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend it. If you are toying with the idea of getting a 3D printer for printing off miniatures or anything like that, it is well worth the purchase. And in my opinion, you'll easily make your money back by printing off all your different minis. So I hope you've enjoyed that video. And if you want us to do anything more on 3D printing, if you want us to explore things like how these all turn out and what different types of models we've got, we had some ideas about maybe subscribing to different Patreon creators and doing some coverage of all the different models that you can get from them and stuff like that. Let us know in the comments whether or not that's something you're interested in. In the meantime, make sure you hit that like button, because it helps YouTube to show this video to more people, and we'll be back in the future with some more awesome content. Bye!